Picture this. You're sitting in your car, outside the fanciest hotel in town, watching through tinted windows as your former boss steps out of a black limousine, straightening his designer tuxedo like he owns the world. 3 months ago, this man destroyed your career over a complete lie. Tonight, he's hosting the biggest charity gala of the year, surrounded by the city's elite, basking in praise for his so-called generosity. But what he doesn't know is that I'm about to walk through those doors and deliver the most spectacular plot twist of his entitled life. I'm about to tell you the wildest revenge story you've ever heard, and I promise you, the ending will blow your mind. But first, let me take you back to where this all began, because understanding what this man did to me will make tonight's payback so much sweeter. My name is Sarah, and 6 months ago I was the head of marketing at Pinnacle Dynamics, one of the most prestigious consulting firms in the city. I had worked there for 4 years, climbing my way up from an entry-level position to running campaigns that brought in millions of dollars for the company. I loved my job. I was good at it. I had a team of 12 people who respected me, and I thought I had finally found my place in the corporate world. My boss, Richard Blackstone, was everything you'd expect from a wealthy CEO: expensive suits, perfectly styled grey hair, the kind of confident swagger that comes from never facing real consequences. He had built Pinnacle Dynamics from the ground up over 15 years, and he made sure everyone knew it. Richard was the kind of man who believed his success gave him the right to treat people however he wanted. For 3 years, our professional relationship was perfectly fine. He respected my work. I delivered results, and we maintained that polite distance you have with executives. But everything changed when Richard hired his nephew Marcus, straight out of business school. Marcus was 25, arrogant beyond belief, and had never worked a real day in his life. Richard gave him a senior position in my department, supposedly to learn the business from the ground up. But it became clear very quickly that Marcus wasn't there to learn anything. He was there to eventually take over. From day one, Marcus questioned every decision I made. He would go directly to Richard with suggestions that contradicted my strategies, always framing it like he was trying to help the company. During team meetings, he would interrupt me mid-sentence to offer his own ideas, which were usually terrible, but delivered with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing your uncle signs the paychecks. I tried to be professional about it. I really did. I figured if I just continued doing excellent work, the results would speak for themselves. And they did. Our campaigns were performing better than ever. Client satisfaction was at an all-time high. My team was hitting every target and exceeding expectations. But Marcus was getting frustrated that his obvious attempts to undermine me weren't working. So he decided to get creative. It was a Tuesday morning in March, when everything fell apart. I walked into the office to find Richard waiting in my cubicle area, his face red with anger. He was holding a printed email, and I could see the veins in his forehead pulsing. Before I could even set down my coffee, he started yelling. Apparently, someone had sent confidential client information to our biggest competitor, Meridian Group. Not just any information, but detailed pricing strategies, client contact lists, and proprietary campaign data that could have cost us millions of dollars in lost business. The worst part was that the email had been sent from my company account. I stood there in complete shock as Richard accused me of corporate espionage. He was screaming about trust and betrayal while my entire team watched from their desks. I tried to explain that I had never sent any email to Meridian Group, that someone must have hacked my account or used my credentials somehow. But Richard wasn't interested in hearing explanations. He had already made up his mind. In his eyes, I was guilty, and that was the end of it. Within 2 hours, I was escorted out of the building by security. 4 years of hard work, gone in an instant. Richard made sure to tell everyone in the office exactly why I was being fired, destroying my reputation with every person I had worked alongside. He painted me as a traitor who had sold out the company for money. The humiliation was devastating, but what came next was even worse. Richard didn't just fire me quietly, he made sure word spread throughout our entire industry. Within a week, every major consulting firm in the city had heard the story of Sarah the corporate spy. Job interviews that had been scheduled were suddenly cancelled. Recruiters stopped returning my calls. I was effectively blacklisted from the career I had spent years building. For 2 months, I applied to hundreds of positions, both in and outside of consulting. But Richard's influence reached everywhere. The few interviews I managed to get would go well until they called my previous employer for a reference. Then, mysteriously, the position would be filled by someone else. I was running out of savings, living on credit cards, and starting to panic about how I was going to pay rent when I finally got a breakthrough. An old college friend named Jennifer worked at a small digital marketing agency across town. They were looking for someone with my experience, and Jennifer convinced her boss to give me a chance despite the rumors. It wasn't the prestigious position I had before, and the pay was significantly lower, but I was grateful to be working again. More importantly, it gave me access to something I desperately needed: the truth. During my first week at the new job, I was learning their email systems when Jennifer mentioned something interesting. She had heard through the grapevine that Richard Blackstone had recently been promoted to head of marketing at Pinnacle Dynamics. Apparently, he had been the hero who discovered the security breach in my email account and helped prevent even more sensitive information from being leaked. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about the timing felt wrong. Marcus gets hired, spends months trying to undermine me, and then conveniently discovers evidence that gets me fired and creates the perfect opening for his promotion. It was too neat, too convenient. I started doing some digging. I used my new company's database access to research Meridian Group, the competitor that had supposedly received our confidential information. What I found was fascinating. 3 days after I was fired, Meridian announced they had hired a new senior consultant, Richard Blackstone. Marcus had never actually taken the promotion at Pinnacle Dynamics. He had used the information from the supposed hack to land a job at their biggest competitor, then quit Pinnacle within a week of my termination. But that was just the beginning. I spent the next month investigating everything I could about Marcus and Richard. I contacted former Pinnacle employees who had left the company, used social media to track Marcus's activities, and even hired a private investigator with my remaining savings. What I uncovered was an intricate web of corruption that went far beyond just framing me for corporate espionage. Richard Blackstone had been using Pinnacle Dynamics as his personal piggy bank for years. He had been inflating expenses, creating fake consulting contracts with shell companies he owned, and skimming money from client payments. The charity work he was famous for, most of those donations were coming from fraudulent billing to clients who thought they were paying for legitimate business services. Marcus knew about all of it. In fact, he had been helping his uncle move money around and create false documentation. My firing hadn't just been about getting me out of the way, so Marcus could take over my position. It had been about eliminating someone who was getting too close to noticing the financial irregularities. As head of marketing, I had access to client billing information and budget reports. I had been asking questions about certain expenses that didn't make sense, requesting documentation for campaigns that seemed overpriced. Richard and Marcus realized that if I kept digging, I might uncover their entire operation. So they decided to frame me and destroy my credibility before I could expose them. The private investigator I hired was a former police detective named Mike Rodriguez. He had experience with white-collar crime and knew how to trace financial records that most people couldn't access. Within 3 weeks, Mike had gathered enough evidence to prove that Richard had stolen over $2 million from Pinnacle Dynamics and its clients over the past 5 years. We had bank records showing transfers to Richard's personal accounts. We had forged contracts with companies that didn't exist. We had testimonies from former employees who had been pressured to sign off on suspicious expenses. Most importantly, we had digital forensic evidence showing that the email sent to Meridian Group had actually been sent from Marcus's laptop, using software that spoofed my email address. I had enough evidence to send both Richard and Marcus to prison for fraud, embezzlement, and corporate espionage. But I wanted more than just justice. I wanted revenge. That's when Mike told me about the gala. Every year Richard hosted a massive charity event to raise money for underprivileged children. It was the social event of the season, attended by politicians, business leaders, and wealthy philanthropists from across the region. Richard used the gala to boost his public image and generate positive publicity for Pinnacle Dynamics. This year's gala was particularly important because Richard was being honored with a humanitarian award for his charitable contributions. The ceremony was going to be broadcast live on local television, and several major news outlets were planning to cover the event. It was perfect. Richard would be at the height of his public glory, surrounded by everyone whose opinion mattered to him, when I would walk in and expose him for the fraud he really was. But I didn't want to just crash the party and start yelling accusations. That would make me look crazy and desperate. I needed a plan that would be undeniable, dramatic, and absolutely devastating to Richard's reputation. That's when I came up with the plot twist that would make this revenge legendary. I spent 2 weeks preparing every detail. I had Mike create a comprehensive presentation with all of our evidence, organized in a way that would be easy for anyone to understand. We included bank records, forged documents, email traces, and sworn statements from former employees. Everything was verified and legally bulletproof. But the presentation was just part 1 of my plan. Part 2 required me to become someone Richard would never expect to see at his gala. I couldn't just show up as Sarah, the disgraced former employee. I needed an identity that would get me through the door and keep me there long enough to execute my revenge. So I became Isabella Rodriguez, Mike's fictional niece and an investigative journalist from New York. Mike had connections with several legitimate news organizations, and he was able to get me press credentials for the event. As far as anyone knew, Isabella Rodriguez was there to cover the charity gala for a major newspaper. I bought an expensive evening gown, hired a professional makeup artist, and practiced speaking with a slight accent that would help disguise my voice. The transformation was remarkable. Even I barely recognized myself in the mirror. 3 days before the gala, I sent an anonymous tip to the local FBI field office, along with copies of all our evidence. I made sure they knew that Richard would be at the charity event and that it would be the perfect time to arrest him in front of witnesses. But I also told them I needed 48 hours to complete my own investigation before they took action. The night of the gala finally arrived, and I was ready. I drove to the Grandview Hotel, one of those old money establishments with marble columns and crystal chandeliers in every room. The parking lot was full of luxury cars, and a red carpet led from the curb to the main entrance. Photographers were stationed along the walkway, taking pictures of every guest as they arrived. I watched from my car as Richard stepped out of his limousine, waving at the cameras like he was some kind of celebrity. He looked so confident, so sure of himself. He had no idea that his entire world was about to collapse. I waited until the initial rush of arrivals had died down, then made my entrance. The press credentials got me past security without any questions, and I walked into the most opulent ballroom I had ever seen. There were probably 300 people there, all dressed in their finest formal wear, sipping champagne and pretending to care about charity. Richard was holding court near the front of the room, surrounded by admirers and sycophants who hung on his every word. He was telling some story about his business philosophy, while gesturing grandly with his champagne glass. Several city councilmen were laughing at his jokes, and I recognized at least 2 judges from the local courthouse in his little audience. I spent the first hour moving around the room, taking pictures and conducting brief interviews with various guests. Everyone assumed I was just another journalist covering the event, and several people were eager to talk about how wonderful Richard was and how much good his charity work had done for the community. It was sickening, but it also made what I was about to do so much more satisfying. Around 8:30, the formal program began. Richard took the stage to give his opening remarks, thanking everyone for their generosity and talking about the importance of giving back to the community. He looked so proud, so dignified, standing there in his perfect tuxedo with his perfect hair and his perfect smile. The program included several speakers who praised Richard's business acumen and charitable spirit. A local news anchor served as the master of ceremonies, and she introduced each speaker with glowing descriptions of their accomplishments. When Richard's award presentation came up, the praise was so over the top that I almost felt embarrassed for everyone involved. But I waited. I needed the perfect moment, when Richard would be most vulnerable and the audience would be most receptive to what I had to say. That moment came when Richard took the stage to accept his humanitarian award. He gave a long speech about the importance of ethical business practices and how successful people have a responsibility to help those less fortunate. The irony was almost too much to bear. As Richard finished his speech and the audience began to applaud, I made my move. I walked up to the front of the room, my press credentials clearly visible, and asked if I could pose a few questions for my article. The event organizers were happy to accommodate what they thought was positive media coverage, and they handed me a microphone. Richard smiled condescendingly at me from the stage, probably expecting softball questions about his charitable work and business success. The entire room was watching, including the television cameras that were broadcasting live to thousands of viewers across the city. I looked directly at Richard and asked my first question in the sweetest, most professional voice I could manage. Mr. Blackstone, I'm investigating reports that you've been embezzling money from Pinnacle Dynamics and using fraudulent charity donations to cover your tracks. Would you care to comment on these allegations? The room went completely silent. Richard's smile froze on his face, and I could see the blood draining from his cheeks. Several people in the audience gasped, and I heard someone near the back whisper, "Oh my God," but I wasn't finished. I had spent 3 months preparing for this moment, and I was going to make it count. Before Richard could recover enough to respond, I continued, "I have bank records showing that you've transferred over $2 million from company accounts to your personal investments. I also have evidence that you framed your former head of marketing, Sarah Mitchell, for corporate espionage to prevent her from discovering your embezzlement scheme." Richard finally found his voice, but it came out as a strangled croak. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is outrageous. Security." But I was ready for that too. I pulled out a thick folder of documents and held it up for everyone to see. I have sworn affidavits from former Pinnacle employees, digital forensic evidence showing how the corporate espionage was actually committed by your nephew Marcus, and financial records proving that most of your charitable donations were made with money stolen from your clients. The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting questions, photographers were snapping pictures, and the television cameras were capturing every second of Richard's humiliation. Several guests were already pulling out their phones to record videos, and I could see the panic in Richard's eyes as he realized this was all being broadcast live. But here's where the real plot twist comes in. The part that makes this revenge story absolutely legendary. Because you see, I wasn't actually Isabella Rodriguez, investigative journalist from New York, and while everything I had said about Richard's crimes was absolutely true, I had one more surprise that would make this night unforgettable. I looked directly into the television camera and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is not Isabella Rodriguez. My name is Sarah Mitchell, the woman Richard Blackstone destroyed 3 months ago with his lies and corruption. And I want everyone in this room to know that the FBI is currently preparing arrest warrants based on the evidence I've provided them." The look on Richard's face was priceless. Pure terror, mixed with rage and disbelief. He finally realized who I was, and the full scope of what I had just done to him was beginning to sink in. But I still wasn't finished. I had one last bomb to drop. "Oh, and Richard, that $2 million you stole? I've already helped the FBI freeze all of your personal accounts. Every penny you embezzled has been recovered and will be returned to the clients you defrauded. You're not just exposed, you're broke." That's when Richard completely lost it. He started screaming at me, calling me names that I can't repeat on this platform, and demanding that security remove me from the building. But the damage was already done. His reputation was destroyed, his crimes were exposed on live television, and everyone who had ever respected him now knew exactly what kind of man he really was. The security guards were hesitant to touch me, because I still had my press credentials and the television cameras were recording everything. The event organizers were in complete panic mode, trying to figure out how to handle a situation they had never encountered before. That's when the FBI agents walked through the front door. Mike had coordinated with them perfectly. They had been waiting outside for my signal, and as soon as I revealed my true identity, they knew it was time to make their arrests. Special Agent Patricia Williams walked up to the stage, with her badge clearly visible, and announced that Richard Blackstone was under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The look of absolute devastation on Richard's face, as they handcuffed him in front of 300 of the most important people in the city, was better than any revenge fantasy I had ever imagined. Every politician, judge, business leader, and socialite who had been praising him 15 minutes earlier was now watching him get arrested on live television. But the night wasn't over yet. As Richard was being led away in handcuffs, Agent Williams approached the microphone and addressed the crowd. She announced that the FBI had been investigating Pinnacle Dynamics for several months based on the evidence I had provided, and that they had uncovered additional crimes beyond what I had discovered. Apparently, Richard's embezzlement scheme was even larger than we had realized, and it involved several other business leaders who were probably in that very room. The panic that spread through the crowd was beautiful to watch. People were frantically whispering to each other, trying to figure out if they might be implicated in Richard's crimes. Several guests made hasty exits, probably to call their lawyers. The local news stations picked up the story immediately, and by the next morning it was front-page news across the region. The footage of Richard's arrest was played on every television station and shared millions of times on social media. But here's the most satisfying part of all. Remember Marcus, Richard's nephew who had actually committed the corporate espionage that I was blamed for? The FBI arrested him at his apartment that same night. All of our evidence had led them directly to him, and he confessed to everything within hours. It turns out that Marcus had been even more involved in the embezzlement scheme than we realized. He had been helping Richard create false documentation and moving money between accounts for over a year. When the FBI offered him a plea deal in exchange for testimony against his uncle, he took it immediately. The legal proceedings took several months, but the outcome was everything I had hoped for. Richard was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to everyone he had defrauded. Marcus got 3 years and a permanent ban from working in the financial industry. More importantly, my name was completely cleared. The FBI's investigation proved beyond any doubt that I had been framed, and the story became a cautionary tale about corporate corruption and the importance of whistleblowers. Within 2 weeks of Richard's arrest, I had job offers from 6 different consulting firms, including 2 of the most prestigious companies in the industry. Everyone wanted to hire the woman who had single-handedly exposed one of the biggest corporate fraud cases in the city's history. I chose to work for Davidson & Associates, Pinnacle Dynamics' biggest competitor. They offered me a senior vice president position with a salary that was almost double what I had been making before. The irony was perfect. Richard's attempt to destroy my career had actually launched me to the highest position I had ever achieved. But the best part wasn't the job, or the money, or even seeing Richard in prison. The best part was the message I received from my former team at Pinnacle Dynamics. After Richard's arrest, the company was restructured and sold to new ownership. All of my former colleagues who had witnessed my humiliating termination sent me a group message apologizing for not speaking up when Richard was destroying my reputation. They told me how much they had respected my work and how sorry they were that they had believed the lies about corporate espionage. Several of them had testified for the FBI about Richard's suspicious behavior and the irregularities they had noticed, but been too afraid to report. Their testimonies had been crucial in building the case against him. It felt like vindication on every possible level. Not only had I proven my innocence and exposed Richard's crimes, but I had also earned the respect and admiration of everyone who had watched him destroy me. The story became something of a legend in our industry. People still talk about the night Sarah Mitchell crashed Richard Blackstone's charity gala and brought down his entire criminal empire with a single microphone and a folder full of evidence. I've been asked to speak at business conferences about corporate ethics and the importance of standing up to corruption. My story has been featured in several magazines and even inspired a case study that's taught in business schools. But more than anything, this experience taught me that sometimes the best revenge is simply telling the truth at the right moment in the right way to the right audience. Richard Blackstone thought he could destroy my life and get away with it because he was wealthy and powerful and well-connected. He believed that his status in the community would protect him from consequences and that a disgraced former employee like me could never touch him. He was wrong, dead wrong. And now, instead of being remembered as a successful businessman and philanthropist, Richard Blackstone will forever be known as the corrupt executive who got arrested on live television at his own charity gala. That, my friends, is what perfect revenge looks like.